More than anything else in his life, Reagan loved the movies. This was the industry that made him into an American success.
How do you do, everybody? I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ronald Reagan.
I think acting was central to the success of Ronald Reagan's presidency.
Reagan was not only handsome, he was photogenic. And he had a good voice, but the camera liked him.
He was quite a ladies' man. He dated a lot of starlets in Hollywood.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Reagan's best remembered speech, the one that many people consider to be the finest speech he ever gave, was one that he did not expect to give.
We will never forget them as they slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
I think he just felt as a human being, here I am, President of the United States. It was very personal.
And things began to crumble.
The Iran-Contra scandal almost derailed Ronald Reagan's presidency.
Oh my God.
I was about 5 feet away from John Hinckley Jr. when he shot Ronald Reagan and 3 other people.
He's walking, and when he gets off camera, he collapses.
We still had the memory of these other assassinations in our consciousness.
What Reagan understood was that the greatest power of a president is to convey a sense of optimism.
He conducted his life in the White House, much as a movie. This was a strong man. He knew just what he wanted to accomplish, and he stayed with it.
To get a sense of him, one cannot separate what he did in the motion picture industry from the man.
In the waning years of his life, and deep in the throes of Alzheimer's disease, Ronald Reagan's memories of his years in the White House were all but gone. The former actor who used to memorize pages and pages of scripts didn't recall that as president, he had presided over one of the greatest economic expansions of any presidency. Nor did he likely recall that he precipitated the end of the Cold War and the so-called evil empire that had perpetrated it for half a century. He probably didn't remember that he appointed more women and minorities to office than had ever been seen in the history of the United States. But hand in hand with his achievements were forgotten scandals, tragedies, and personal and family failures. Moments that shaped one of the most popular, controversial, and influential presidents of the 20th century. Reagan's path from Depression-era youth to President of the United States reads like the unlikeliest of movie plots. In every sense of the word, the story of Ronald Reagan is an American story.
His father couldn't keep a job. His father was an alcoholic, and the family bounced from town to town and city to city during the first several years. They finally landed in Dixon, Illinois.
Reagan's childhood home in Dixon is now a tourist destination.
We were just on our way west, and I had seen it on the map and wanted to stop here.
He did a lot for this country, you know. It's just something everyone should do is see places like this.
Here begins the first act of Reagan's life, but it is anything but idyllic.
Jack Reagan was a great father when he was sober. He was an Irish Catholic, he told good stories, he was fun to be around. But he fell off the wagon periodically, and when he did, he was utterly unreliable. He was somebody that a young kid like Ronald Reagan simply couldn't look up to with any kind of respect.
While walking home one February afternoon in 1922, Reagan comes across his father passed out on the front step.
He stood there for a moment and asked himself what he should do. Should he simply walk on by, or should he try to wake up his dad and bring him into the house? If he had left his father there, his father might well die, freeze in the snow. And for a kid of 11 to be thinking that, to have that kind of weight on his shoulders, was a pretty heavy thing.
Everybody's family has problems, and it's a question of how you cope with it. In Ronald Reagan's case, he had a mother who was devoutly Christian, and being a Christian is the belief in positivism.
Nell Reagan provides the love and stability her sons crave.
Nell Reagan was the cement that held the family together. When the father wasn't reliable, she was always there.
As an active member of the Disciples of Christ, she organizes church talent shows and provides young Ronald, nicknamed Dutch, with his first audience.
He was an insecure kid, and he didn't feel at ease in much of his regular life, but he discovered once he got on stage, that's where he really shone.
My name is Ronald Reagan. I've been asked to remind the congregation that we have the church rummage sale this Saturday. Ladies, it's a good chance to get rid of the things you don't need around the house. Bring your husbands. Also, today's sermon topic is, what is hell? Come early and listen to the choir practice.
And that's where he discovered what he used to call the music of applause. He learned to tell jokes. He learned to make people laugh. And in his early days, the ability to make people laugh eased the emotional insecurity that Reagan had. But when he went into politics, it turned out to be one of his secret weapons.
I mean, this interesting kind of self-deprecating humor, that was one of his more positive traits. He had no problem kidding himself to illustrate a point, and people liked that.
He discovered that if you can get people to laugh with you, you're halfway to getting them to agree with you. And that served him very well for his entire political life.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet.
In the 1920s, Ronald Reagan, like the rest of America, falls in love with the cinema.
It was what people did on Saturdays to set aside the cares of the week. They would go to the movie theater, they would watch a double feature, and you could put your ordinary cares behind you.
Watching popular comedies, westerns, and cartoons, Reagan imagines himself on the screen.
He loved Hollywood. I just cannot emphasize enough. Often had heroes, Western heroes or whatever. So it gave him a sense of possibilities, and it fired up his imagination.
Here's this kid in small town Illinois, and he has this dream. One day I'm going to be a movie star. If he had known the odds against this, he probably would have given it up. But one of the beauties of being a kid is you don't know the odds. So he could dream, he could imagine.
In high school, Reagan joins every theater performance he can and discovers he likes playing the hero. In the summers, he is the hero of Rock River.
Summers, he got a job lifeguarding. He thought that was pretty cool because he was sort of the star of his stretch of the park. As a lifeguard, Reagan developed his first sense of responsibility because, yeah, you get to be around the kids and the pretty girls, but ultimately you're responsible for keeping people from drowning.
Help, Roy!
He supposedly saved 77 people from drowning in the Rock River.
You okay, buddy?
You're right. And I have to think that a little bit of this carried over into his political career, because when you're governor of California, when you're president of the United States, you are responsible for people.
When the stock market collapses in October of 1929, Reagan is only 18 years old and fresh out of high school.
His dad lost his job. He had to go many miles away to work, so his parents were separated. He said a lot of the dads that he knew in town in Dixon, Illinois, when they would come home, were like lining up to get food and handouts.
What was happening in the United States during that period was very dark. There was almost 20% unemployment. People were living on streets. It was a grim scene in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt was trying everything he possibly could to get the country out of unemployment.
We were facing serious problems. The country was dying by inches. We were faced by a condition and not a theory.
In Europe, there was a growing threat of fascism. The future did not look bright.
Reagan's hopes of making something of his life come down to attempting what no one in his family had ever done: graduate high school and get a college degree.
His parents didn't go to college, didn't even go to high school. Neither one of his parents made it past grade school.
He wanted to figure out how he could get to Hollywood. College would be a next step, and off he went to Eureka College.
But Eureka College is in financial distress, and classes necessary for graduation are being cut. This crisis would mark the beginning of Ronald Reagan's political career.
They felt that students needed to stand up and make a protest. Furthermore, they saw this Ronald Reagan, who's a good-looking guy and who has had dramatic training. He can give a speech. They said, this is the one who ought to do it.
Dutch, you got a second?
Yeah.
What's up? Everybody's on board. The committee wants to strike.
Really? Total boycott of all classes until the trustees reverse the budget cuts and reinstate the courses.
Or we get the president to resign.
Well, that's swell.
Yeah, but we need a freshman to lead it. It's got to be you.
Me.
You, Dutch. Make a speech. Plead our case.
Be our voice. I don't know, guys. This could totally kill my career as a student. What the hell? I'll do it.
It's the first really sort of political speech of his life. And one could see this as his audition for the political world. And he does really well in this audition.
Reagan graduates in 1932, still harboring secret dreams of becoming an actor. But with Hollywood a long shot, Reagan sets his sights on another exploding industry, radio.
A new voice began to fill our homes, the voice of radio.
Of the broadcast media, radio is perhaps the most intimate because you have to imagine the person. You hear the voice, and the voice gets inside your head.
He first found his real talent and communication, and he was the master communicator. He found it in calling, radio announcing on baseball games.
Hello again, folks. Here's something hot right off the griddle.
Sports radio is cheap entertainment, but announcers have to capture the imagination of listeners at home.
It seemed like a first step into show business. That's what radio was to Reagan. He had been looking around, going from radio station to radio station. Everybody said, we don't have anything for you. We need somebody who has had experience.
I'm a busy man, Mr. Reagan.
And he was walking out of one of these stations.
It's Reagan.
He said, well, how in the hell can anybody get experience if you can't get a job in the first place? And the director of that particular radio station heard this and said, okay, here's the guy who's got some spunk. Let's see what he can do. Let's try an audition here. I want you to paint a picture for me. I want you to tell me the story of the end of a game. So Reagan recalled a football game he had played in, and he reimagined things a little bit, and he told this really gripping account of the game-winning run.
Reagan is offered a job calling football games for $5 and bus fare.
The young Reagan, how handsome he was, how charismatic, how charming. And then when you combine that with going into a career in broadcasting and acting, he really honed his communications chops at a very early age.
Ronald Reagan is still a relative unknown and Hollywood a distant dream.
The fabulous city of Hollywood, mecca of the motion picture industry.
But a once-in-a-lifetime encounter is about to open a door and change all of history. Americans in the 1930s suffer massive unemployment. But a young Ronald Reagan is able to keep working in radio, announcing baseball games for the Chicago Cubs.
Reagan broadcast the baseball games, but they didn't have the money to send him to all the away games. And so what they did was they would reproduce the sounds of the game, and they had what the equivalent of a ticker that would tell, okay, it's a pitch, it's a curveball, strike one, and so on. And he would read this, and then he would announce the game from this, as though he was there. And for the most part, this went well, but Reagan used to tell a story later of a time when the ticker went dead.
The ninth with Dizzy Dean on the mound and Billy Jurgis at bat for the Cubs. And Dean winds up to pitch. And,
what's he gonna do? Because he's got no incoming information.
And the pitch is foul.
And so he has this one batter foul off pitch after pitch after pitch. If anybody was paying attention, they must have thought that this particular batter had set a world record for the most consecutive foul balls. Finally, the ticker came up again, and Reagan is able to go on.
And he's out of there.
It's a little bit unclear how many people were actually fooled by this. But the bigger point is that Reagan could tell a story.
Well, I heard him tell that story once to Walter Cronkite, who had gotten his start as an announcer, and Reagan told his baseball story, and Cronkite said, well, by golly, same thing happened to him. In his case, the ticker tape went dead on a football game. And, when he was president, he would often tell stories about his life. One had the very direct sense, you're not sure whether you're hearing a historical story or an imaginary story. You couldn't quite tell the difference.
During the Depression, movies become a key source of entertainment.
Hollywood was actually a successful industry that managed to escape the ravages of the Depression, because the one thing Americans were trying to do was have some sense of entertainment.
Those were the days when Hollywood was very much in the business of cheering up America.
The popularity of motion pictures gives birth to the studio system.
All the movie studios in Hollywood had a distinctive look. Metro, Goldwyn Mayer, MGM made these huge musicals, and they were very splashy, and Paramount had its own sort of look, and then there was Universal.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Warner Brothers was turning out movies that had a lot of grit to them.
Take 'em out.
More than anything else in his life, Reagan loved the movies.
While covering the Cubs in spring training, Reagan diverts to Hollywood to visit an old friend.
He got in touch with a young woman that he knew, Joy Hodges, who had gone from Illinois and had managed to get a start in Hollywood. So he had dinner with her.
Any advice at all, happily take it.
There is one thing.
What?
Take off your glasses. Now that's better. Movie actors don't wear glasses. You know, my agent is looking for clients. I could set you up with a meeting.
And she was able to set him up with an agent. And Reagan makes the deal with the agent, and the agent looks him over and says, okay, this is a possibility. And so arranges a screen test for Reagan.
Hey, Ellen.
Hello, Bill.
Max is expecting us.
He's on the phone with Mr. Warner. I'll let him know you're here.
Not nervous, are you?
Wouldn't you be?
You're the boss. Max, this is Dutch Reagan, the fellow I've been telling you about.
Reagan was not only handsome, he was photogenic. And he had a good voice, and he made a very good impression. So they give him the screen test, and it turns out that the camera liked him.
I'll show him to Jack. We're here.
But that name,
In this place.
Dutch. So you got a real first name?
This moment.
Ronald.
Together.
Ronald. Reagan. Ronald Reagan.
2 weeks later, he gets a telegram saying, we want to hire you as a contract player.
How do you do, everybody? I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ronald Reagan. A few months ago, I was a sports announcer on a radio station in Des Moines, Iowa.
So he quits his job, buys a car, heads out to California.
One day I ran into one of these movie talent scouts. I think I caught him off guard because the next thing I knew, I was taking a screen test for Warner Brothers in Hollywood. I guess it was okay. At least I liked Hollywood, so here I am.
The contract was written all in the studio's favor. But it was a contract, it was a job, it was in Hollywood. And he said, sign it before they change their minds.
I'll see you in the movies.
Because this was a remarkable thing in a country that was in dire circumstances, that this young guy, 26 years old, would essentially win the lottery.
Hey, give me an entrance, will you?
He started off making a lot of movies, and they were made very fast. And these were called B movies. And the reason they were called B movies is they were shorter films than the longer movies that were, say, 90 minutes or 2 hours. And they usually ran as a secondary movie.
Some not very good. He would say that they had to be done not well, but done on Thursday. Like this was an assembly line.
If you're on a bucking bronco, you gallop the steer, dive out of the saddle, grab him by the horns, wrestle with him, throw him down, and tie up his leg. That's all. That's all.
His first movie is called Love is on the Air. Shot probably that month. It's in the theaters that fall.
My job is spreading news. That guy and his mayor brother-in-law are in with Nicey Ferguson's gang.
Within a year of being at Warner Brothers, he had made almost a dozen movies. So that tells you how fast that they were turning these out. Warner Brothers had a stable of movie stars who could be great at doing this kind of drama and that. Warner Brothers had Ronald Reagan, who was an American everyman. He was a hero. He was a person who would be attractive to women, but he could also be attractive to a male because he had a rugged good looks. He could be in a Western.
Tough luck, son. I guess we can't all have charm and good looks, too.
He began making a series of action and adventure films.
Most famously was the series of movies called Brass Bancroft, who was a Secret Service agent for the government and would go on these adventures. And he did 4 of those.
He's essentially saving the country from counterfeiters, from terrorists.
That's what they're doing, all right. Bleaching dollar bills and reprinting them in higher denominations on those stolen plates.
Kids across America love these movies. Reagan was, in a way, the Indiana Jones of his day.
Reagan uses his newfound celebrity to woo women.
He was quite a ladies' man. He dated a lot of starlets in Hollywood.
There were plenty of attractive young women in Hollywood, and eventually his eye fell on Jane Wyman.
Who is, by the way, on her 3rd marriage.
Jane Wyman's background was in its own way as difficult as Reagan's upbringing was. And from Reagan's perspective, he invested himself emotionally in Jane in a way that he never had to anyone else.
Ronald loved Jane Wyman. He was so taken with her.
Reagan has been the rescuer since his days as a lifeguard, and so he's going to rescue Jane. It made him feel needed. It made him feel wanted. He pops the question. They're married.
After we get married, how many sons are we going to have?
How many do you want?
Well, it would be nice to have a full team.
What's your favorite sport?
That's the trouble. Football.
They look like $1 million. He has a pretty good trajectory going on.
But outside the walls of the studio lot, the real world is about to enter the darkest of times.
We had gone through the Depression, and we still weren't out of it.
I was 7, 8, 9, and the Nazi occupation of Germany, as well as other places, was really brutal.
The world is building toward the most devastating war history would ever know. As the United States struggles to remain neutral, President Franklin Roosevelt takes to the airwaves to calm the fears of Americans.
Roosevelt essentially said again and again, things are going to be okay. The future is going to be better. Reagan heard all this. He listened to this. He appreciated how a president could reach beyond Washington, beyond boundaries, and get into people's minds and hearts.
We have no excuse for defeatism. We have every good reason for hope.
Reagan's parents had raised him to be a Democrat. He votes for FDR not once, but 4 times.
Remember, Ronald Reagan was a child of the Depression. He was a New Deal Democrat. He was a Fair Deal Democrat, although he had become much more conservative by the time he became president.
In fact, he would be opposed to very many of the things that Franklin Roosevelt stood for as president. But one thing never changed, and that was Reagan's appreciation of Franklin Roosevelt as the model of how to be president, especially in times when Americans are uncertain, when they're worried, when they're anxious.
Presidents have to learn to do that, and it's the hardest job. He knew how to embrace, he knew how to covet sadness. And part of that was he was a very good actor.
We face the future with confidence and with courage. We are America.
Ronald Reagan is learning through new forms of media. But everything is about to change. And Reagan will soon discover a nemesis, the crusade against which will become an obsession. Just a few short years of landing in Hollywood, Ronald Reagan makes over a dozen films with Warner Brothers. But he has yet to achieve a breakout role.
Almost from the day that he got to Warner Brothers, he was saving up ideas of things that he wanted to pitch at the studios.
Reagan had this idea for a movie about the Notre Dame football coach, Knute Rockne. And he pitched the idea to the studio.
Reagan said, you should make this movie, and there's a role in this movie for me. One of the football players, George Gipp. He was a legend in American sports.
And the studio looked at it, okay, and they set it aside. And Reagan learned later that there was going to be this movie made about Newt Rockne. And he felt quite miffed that they had basically stolen his idea. And he couldn't prove that, but at least he wanted a role in the movie. He figured, this is my idea, I ought to be in the movie. And they said, no, you can't imagine it. You just don't look like a football player.
Reagan pulled out a photograph of him in his football uniform from his youth. He took these photographs back to the producer. He showed him these photographs and said, this is the part I was born to play. And he convinced him.
Well, baseball's my dish. Would you like to play football? Not much.
Well, for any actor in Hollywood, a deathbed scene was a tremendous opportunity. This was a scene where there was drama and the audience was focused in on it. And he has the great line that became an iconic political line where he says,
Win just one for the Gipper.
Win one for the Gipper.
It became a signature line of Ronald Reagan, something that made his career, that he was identified with.
Now considered an A-lister, Reagan takes advantage of newly available opportunities.
Jane, being a leading actress in Hollywood, was on the board of the Screen Actors Guild. When an opening came on the board, she said, I think Ronnie would be a great person for the Guild to have. He loves the issues, and he's got a real future in politics. She said, I think he might even end up as president of the United States one day. She actually said that, and he was very committed. He would be working on a movie during the daytime, and then when that movie wrapped, he would go from Warner Brothers in Burbank over to the Screen Actors Guild headquarters, and he would hear about the issues that were facing the motion picture industry. Reagan loved it.
With the movie King's Row, Reagan tackles his most dramatic role yet.
This is the best film that Ronald Reagan ever made. He plays a character who meets his psychological demise in this movie and is delivered a setback.
Reagan is waking up from surgery, and this evil surgeon that he's crossed has gratuitously amputated his legs.
Randy! Where's the rest of me? Randy!
Reagan believed that that was his moment of dramatic breakthrough.
It was that accident.
King's Row was a huge success for Warner Brothers. It was a box office success.
Reagan thought the role was good enough that he ought to get an Oscar nomination. The studio differed. They realized that he wasn't quite as good as he thought he was.
The awarding of Oscar statuettes to its outstanding talent of the previous year.
The movie gets nominated for Best Picture, but he doesn't get nominated for Best Actor. And then the war starts.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
With the attack on Pearl Harbor, America finds itself pulled into a world war that has already been raging in Europe for 2 years.
We are going to win this war, and we are going to win the peace that follows.
And there were no exemptions for movie stars. So Reagan goes off to war.
And the beat of feet sounds over the land. Feet intent on training, on growing fit for whatever destiny holds ahead. Heroes, everyone.
Reagan enlists in the Army Cavalry, hoping that learning to ride horses will help his movie career. But he is stationed in, of all places, Culver City, California. His job, make films.
Even if Reagan had wanted to go off and fight in the front, he couldn't. He was too nearsighted. And one of the examining doctors said, if we put you out there, you'd probably shoot one of your own generals. And another doctor had to be there said, yeah, but you'd miss him. They weren't going to let him anywhere near weapons.
This is not theory. It's been proven in action.
Reagan was in a unit that made training films for people in the Air Force. This unit was set up by the War Department to make films to train American soldiers to become pilots because we had a shortage of pilots.
Remember, every minute wasted in joining up means 3,000 feet of altitude you won't have when you need it most. Thank you, sir.
Reagan, during World War II, makes like over 260 films. He was constantly the propaganda voice for Army Air Corps by trying to bring morale to the troops.
When the United States went in and liberated the concentration camps, the Army photographed it. There were films of this. And these films were processed in Los Angeles at the Army facility that Reagan supervised.
Ronald Reagan saw the very first, as it was being developed, footage of the concentration camps being liberated.
It was a remarkable moment for him as a young man to be able to see this is what evil is. This is what we're fighting against. He connected it to any type of totalitarian threat. He connected it in his mind, certainly, to the communist threat. Little did the public know that the communists were killing millions as well. It was, in a way, a transformative moment for Reagan, seeing these, and it became for him a symbol of evil in the world. He kept one of these films and he told his son, if there ever comes a time in this country where people say this never happened, it was a fiction, he said, I'll have proof that it actually happened.
After World War II, two remaining superpowers find themselves competing for world domination.
Right after World War II, America found itself as one of two powers in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union.
As World War II began, the Soviet Union was on the side of the Allies. And it was an uneasy relationship, but it was a relationship. And yet at the end of the war, the fear was that Joseph Stalin, who was the dictator of the Soviet Union, would now want to advance into Western Europe. He wanted world domination. Well, fortunately, the United States had the atomic bomb.
But that doesn't stop the Soviets from infiltrating the heart of American culture, Hollywood.
The movies and Hollywood were flying the American flag all over the world. So this made a prime target for the Soviets to come in.
Little does Reagan know that he will end up in the forefront of the fight against Hollywood films and filmmakers sympathetic to Stalinist ideology.
Reagan saw this insidious force that was trying to take over a small group of people, small minority, who were trying to take over the industry that he loved. This was the industry that made him into an American success. And he decided to fight back.
It is this battle which will cost Ronald Reagan dearly. In the wake of the Second World War, Reagan tries to pick up where he left off in his acting career, but he finds that's no easy task.
The momentum that he had from King's Row and Newt Rockney All-American is kind of dissipated. And he kind of looks differently. He's a little heavier around the face, not quite the rakish, fast-talking kid that he was just a few years ago.
His career began to stall out. It just sort of plateaued. He wasn't going down, but he wasn't going up. But that's sort of not a great place to be for an actor.
Reagan's stardom isn't the only thing fading. His marriage to Jane Wyman falters.
They have a few good years together. They have a couple of children together. But Jane gradually outgrew Reagan. Jane was changing, I think, more than Ronald Reagan was. And she was going places. And in her changing expectations of her spouse, he no longer measured up. So Reagan discovers that his wife, Jane, wants a divorce. It hit him like a 2x4.
Ronald loved Jane Wyman. And Jane Wyman dropped him. He didn't end that, she ended it. So he was really crestfallen.
Divorce was not common in the 1940s and 1950s, even in Hollywood. As difficult as his mother's relationship with his father had been, they never divorced. Reagan understood that Jane sometimes was unhappy, but to go from unhappy to, I want a divorce, that was a big deal. Reagan didn't see that coming, and it was quite a shock. And then things fell apart. First, his marriage fell apart. Then he discovered that he wasn't getting the roles that he wanted. It made him realize, okay, I am, in fact, never going to regain what I thought I was going to have in Hollywood. I have to look for the next thing.
In 1947, Reagan is elected president of the Screen Actors Guild.
10 years after landing in Hollywood, he is president of the union of the biggest movie stars in the world. He's their leader.
And it was a time when Richard Nixon and others in Washington were holding hearings on a committee called the House Un-American Activities Committee. There was actually a committee of the House of Representatives which said, we're here to expose un-Americans in this country.
There was this grave fear on the part of people who were concerned about communism that somehow these radical ideas would infiltrate movies. And from movies, they would go into the popular consciousness because the movie industry influenced so much else. And they want to know, are the communists infiltrating Hollywood?
The Communist Party in America, but certainly in Hollywood, operated in the shadows. They wouldn't tell people that they were communists. They operated in secrecy.
The fear of communism by the United States became increasingly desperate. We viewed everything in this country as us against the dirty commies.
The communists today dominate the lives of more than 800 million people.
And so there's a collectivism that might take hold, that the country would slide toward socialism. Related to this is the fear that there are communist spies. Now, in fact, there were communist spies. They were discovered, prosecuted, and thrown in jail.
It's not just a battle of ideology. A nuclear arms race has begun, with the threat of mutually assured destruction.
This time, the Soviets had not only the atomic bomb, but the hydrogen bomb.
As the head of the Screen Actors Guild, Reagan is called to testify about the communist threat in Hollywood.
It was a tough decision for Reagan, who found himself in the middle of what became known as the Hollywood 10 affair.
10 producers, directors, and screenwriters appear before the committee and are asked, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
They realize if they say yes, they get fired. If they say no, they can get prosecuted for perjury. So what do? They refuse to respond. Reagan wants to sort of split the difference. He's not going to come out and support communism because he doesn't believe in it, but he believes that people ought to have a right to their opinions. It shouldn't be illegal to be a communist. But also, and this is very important, Reagan believed that communism was a threat to America. And so he was willing to cooperate with those people who were going after the communists. He was willing to cooperate, although not openly, with the FBI. The FBI wanted to find out, what do you know about communists in Hollywood? And he told them. He didn't do it publicly. He believed that the FBI had a right to investigate these people who had affiliations to a party that was bent on destroying the United States.
Thank you.
Plenty of people saw Reagan as a traitor to his friends, colleagues in Hollywood. There were people from those days who never forgave Reagan for this. But Reagan himself thought that he didn't have anything to be forgiven for. He didn't think he did anything wrong at all.
Reagan's testimony is an opportunity to show leadership in the political arena.
For the first time, Reagan is in front of cameras, in front of microphones, and he is making overtly political arguments.
I will be frank with you that as a citizen, I would not like to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its political ideology.
And he discovers he's good at this. He discovers that he can talk even when people aren't writing lines for him.
We've spent 170 years in this country on the basis that democracy is strong enough to stand up and fight for itself against the inroads of any ideology, no matter how much we may disagree with it.
This is a guy who can think on his own, who can think on his feet, who can give back just as good as he's getting. He was a very impressive guy in those hearings, and the impression carried on. There are few people who are starting to think, maybe this guy does have a career after Hollywood.
Meanwhile, Reagan has to deal with a bitter and violent strike brought on by a radical new union backed by communist sympathizers.
He got a phone call one day that said that if you cross the picket lines, encourage other people to do so, then we're going to do something to you that's going to end your career. And he told this to the police and they said, yeah, somebody's threatening to throw acid in your face. Reagan remembered that. And he said, that's the way the communists play ball. And it is really dirty ball. And I don't want to have anything to do with it. This first and personal experience with real radicals in Hollywood was one that he recalled as a very formative experience.
Ironically, it's because of communism that Reagan finds the love of his life.
Nancy Davis,
as the woman who was compelled to submit to the brain's satanic vibrations of evil.
Nancy Davis requests a meeting with the SAG leader because she is frequently confused with another actress of the same name. Rumors circulate that the other actress is in fact a communist.
He met Nancy was in his role as head of the Screen Actors Guild, and she had been named in some document as a communist, and she went to him to please get her off the list.
She was an actress who had a very limited career, and she was afraid that there might be some confusion. I don't want to be blacklisted. I don't want to get the public to boycott me.
And Reagan said, don't worry, there's no problem. In fact, he told her this by telephone. But she wanted reassurance in person. What she really wanted was a date with Ronald Reagan. Nancy was looking for a husband, and she made a list of the most eligible Hollywood bachelors, and Ronald Reagan was near the top of that list.
Nancy had her eye on him, and she knew that he was a bachelor. He'd gotten divorced. She was a very smart woman, and so she began to get involved in the Screen Actors Guild. She would go to meetings, and she'd be right on the front row looking up at him, and she wanted to get noticed.
Now, Reagan was still a little bit gun-shy from his marriage to Jane, but Nancy was all in. And so she kept after him.
And they started a date, and it developed into a true romance. He would write her a note every day. They'd be in a meeting, and he'd write a little note and hand it to someone to give to her. And she was enthralled with him.
It was one of the great romances of the American presidency. And Ronald and Nancy Reagan created that story. They told that story to the American people and how they met and how they fell in love. The story that their daughter, Patty, tells was that her parents married because Nancy got pregnant. Ronald Reagan was a very honorable fellow. He was going to certainly marry her, and he did.
They were married in a small ceremony, and 7.5 months later, Nancy gave birth to their first child.
Having begun a family, and with his film career effectively over, Reagan soon discovers a new medium which will propel him into the greatest role of his life. By the mid-1950s, Reagan's career as an actor is all but over.
He didn't fail as an actor. He had just had the unfortunate timing of coming to his peak when Hollywood had to set aside the movies to go off and fight the war. And then by the time the war was over, new audiences wanted new faces on screen.
But Reagan has one last great role to play in Hollywood that will have a profound and lasting impact on the industry. With the growing popularity of television, studios begin licensing their movies to be shown on TV, and actors want a cut of the profits.
Actors are thinking, A, this is taking potential work away from me, and B, this is another stream of revenue that maybe we could participate in. So they bring in Ronald Reagan as the guy to lead the union in this strike in 1960. Reluctantly, he took the job because now he's an adversary against the people that could possibly be hiring him, and he still thought of himself as an actor. But he had the foresight to see how beneficial this would be for working actors.
The Screen Actors Guild, with Reagan at the helm, threatens a complete strike of all actors in Hollywood. The studios think Reagan is bluffing, but Reagan doesn't bluff. 1 week later, he calls the strike.
They shut down the town. The studio is under a lot of pressure because they've never had a complete shutdown.
The studios ultimately relent, and 5 weeks later, the strike is settled.
Starting in 1960, every film made since then, if played on television, actors get residuals. They were thrilled. He resigned like a month later, and that was his last job as Screen Actors Guild. Now, since that strike in 1960, it's now nearly $10 billion has gone into actors' pockets. And that's what Reagan did. Let me show you something. So this is a residual check that I got from SAG. This is a great example of Ronald Reagan creating something that's benefited actors since that strike in 1960.
Reagan sees the potential power television has, not just for his acting peers, but for himself.
Reagan had a great sense of timing in the way he timed his life. He was in radio when most Americans listen to radio, and then he transitioned into the movies when tens of thousands of people were going into the movies, and then he made the leap from movies into television when millions of Americans were going out and buying TV sets.
TV in those days was not in every household, and the pictures were small and they were grainy. He knew, everybody knew, that this was a huge demotion. From the big screen of Hollywood, that's where the serious actors worked. Reagan was always one who could try to put the best face on things. And he would say, this is an exciting new opportunity for me. I'm getting to try out this new medium, television.
And for everyday hand washing, remember Borax or powdered hand soap.
2 fine hand cleaning products from U.S. Borax.
At the same time, General Electric began searching for a new personality to host their TV show, the General Electric Theater. After careful consideration, they select Ronald Reagan as the face of their brand.
For General Electric, here is Ronald Reagan.
Good evening. Tonight, Thomas Mitchell and Vincent Price star on the General Electric Theater.
GE becomes a huge hit for CBS. It's on right after the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday night.
It was generating higher ratings than I Love Lucy.
Reagan acts in many episodes.
He is seen each week by more people than saw him in a year when he was a film actor.
His title was called Program Supervisor, but he was a producer in the sense that he could develop stories that he wanted to dramatize. They were almost always about communists and the communist threat.
Fighting communism, of course, was something that preoccupied this country.
This government has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
We have Soviet missiles in Cuba. They're being attached to nuclear warheads rapidly, and we were now marching more and more into Vietnam.
As the face of GE, Reagan represents management to rank-and-file employees.
I think his General Electric days, as he toured the country and spoke to audiences all over the country, really gave him a much better sense of middle America and the way middle Americans thought at the time.
Reagan is still a Democrat, but his speeches for GE are becoming more and more politically conservative.
He always said the Democratic Party left me, went left, and I stayed where I was. Now, the truth was Reagan also started going right, and he started giving a speech on his tours that was his ringing conservative speech.
It is this speech that draws the attention of the campaign staff of Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater.
Barry Goldwater was not a great spokesperson. His use of the English language left something to be desired. But into that campaign stepped Ronald Reagan.
Reagan agrees to make a stump speech for Goldwater's campaign, and staffers are nervous as the speech is televised nationally.
Ladies and gentlemen, we take pride in presenting a thoughtful address by Ronald Reagan. Mr. Reagan.
Thank you.
It's called The Speech, and it was a very ringing conservative speech.
No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. So government's programs once launched never disappear.
These are people who have their instructions that when he says the word Goldwater, because this is a speech for Goldwater, they're supposed to raise these signs that they've been given. They say Goldwater for president. But he doesn't mention the word Goldwater. And so the audience, they don't know what to do. But gradually they catch on. But this speech really isn't about Goldwater. This speech is about Reagan.
Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth.
Reagan is giving this fantastic speech, but he's doing it much more effectively than Goldwater himself ever did.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
The very next day, there were Reagan for President committees that were being formed around the country. There has never been a single speech that so rapidly launched a political career as that one did.
And Goldwater did go down to defeat, but people saw, aha, here's a new rising star. And it was from there that he was persuaded to run for governor of California.
When he decides to run for governor, he makes his speech not at a podium or at a hotel, but in a set where he's walking around talking to the camera.
I must ask for your continued help, and I do so with a promise to do my utmost.
He had been on television for almost a decade. He knew how to connect with audiences because he knew how to communicate with a camera.
Thank you.
Reagan is running against current Governor Pat Brown, who harshly criticizes Reagan for his acting background.
He told the people of California in an ad, he said, you remember it was an actor who killed Abraham Lincoln. I'm running against an actor. This is not a serious thing. So he tried to minimize Ronald Reagan for being an actor. And the people of California ultimately didn't buy it.
Reagan wins in a landslide and becomes governor of California. As governor, Reagan sticks to his script in shrinking government regulation. But he also encounters unprecedented events like anti-war protests and race riots.
There was a feeling that the country was spinning out of control. And this seemed to many people in the 1960s to be just downright unpatriotic because the country was at war. The generation of their parents was the generation of World War II. When the country is at war, you pull behind the government. And Reagan comes in and he says, what we really need is a stronger sense of authority. We're not going to stand up for these kind of protests. When they throw rocks through windows, we're going to call out the police. We're going to call out the riot police, and we're going to put them in their place. We need to get back to those traditional values. People need to respect the law.
But Reagan's appeal to protesters is rejected.
And I have a special little word for Ronald Reagan in the morning. You, Ronnie, baby.
It wasn't foreign language when Reagan's promoting his vision. It was retro. It had nothing to do with the Vietnam War and counterculture and all the fights of the 60s, but it was a big part of our national DNA of the 30s and 40s.
And this was something that Reagan stood for through most of his political career.
Reagan is never able to connect with a younger audience, but his ability to negotiate in balancing the state's budget wins him a second term.
Reagan believed that the point of getting elected was to govern, and the essence of governing was to make the best compromise you could, not to insist on perfection, but insist on improvement. Reagan was a pragmatist. He never let the perfect get in the way of the good. This was Ronald Reagan as governor. This would be Ronald Reagan as president.
For Reagan, being governor of California, a state and an economy larger than many nations, is only a stepping stone.
In Reagan's life, you can see a pattern of looking for bigger stages. From the stage in his mom's church, to the high school stage, to college, to radio, to Hollywood, to television. The stage as governor of California. Now he's looking to step on the biggest stage of all, the world stage of being president of the United States.
But this stage will be fraught with peril. Having used his film and TV skills to advance in politics, Reagan is now poised to run for the highest office in the land.
The important thing for Ronald Reagan was his fundamental belief in democratic values. He is somebody who truly believes in American exceptionalism and that there's no higher calling than a duty and patriotism to your country.
But he's repeatedly thwarted by bad timing.
He couldn't run in '72 because there was a Republican president, Richard Nixon, and so you don't challenge an elected Republican president.
So Reagan sits out the election and waits for his next chance. When Nixon resigns 2 years into his 4-year term in the wake of the Watergate scandal, Vice President Gerald Ford assumes the office of president. In the general election 2 years later, Ford is the presumptive Republican nominee. But after waiting 4 years to run, Reagan has had enough.
Reagan by this time is getting desperate because he realizes the clock is ticking, time is running out for him. So he takes the big and controversial step of challenging a president of his own party for the nomination. It came close to succeeding, but it failed.
Gerald Ford defeats Reagan in the primary and subsequently loses the presidential election to Democrat Jimmy Carter. 4 years later, in 1980, at age 66, Reagan has one more shot at being president.
Good evening. I'm here tonight to announce my intention to seek the Republican nomination for President of the United States.
After failing in 1976, Ronald Reagan launches a last-ditch effort to claim the Republican nomination for president in 1980.
We will become that shining city on a hill. For our country's future, I pledge you my every effort. I ask for your prayers and your support. I believe that together, we can keep this rendezvous with destiny.
Reagan's message of hope sticks with the voters, and he wins the Republican nomination.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
The race to the White House is on.
Reagan felt he was the embodiment of the people of the country, not of the elites, not of its institutions, but of the everyday people.
This was a guy who used his skills that he picked up in Hollywood and merged them to become this, what he called citizen politician.
Even with Reagan's popularity, some on his campaign are concerned how the nation would view his family dynamic.
Reagan had children by Jane Wyman, his first marriage. The consultants didn't think that they wanted the American public to be reminded that he had been divorced before.
It's not that uncommon.
Divorce cost Rockefeller the election in '64.
I still say that Jane's kids make him look old.
The kids by Jane were full-grown adults at this point. Voters were used to seeing candidates with sort of cute kids. So the consultants trot out the kids that he has with Nancy Reagan. And so we'll bring out Patty and Ron.
While Reagan's popularity grows, Jimmy Carter's founders.
Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter were two entirely different men. I have a great admiration for Jimmy Carter. I think that he was in the wrong job. You know, Jimmy Carter for saint, not for president.
Jimmy Carter had done a lot of things the public thought was wrong, and he suffered what politicians who are successful don't suffer: fate.
Carter's administration is wrestling with an economy that's the worst since the Great Depression. Over 7 million people are unemployed, and growing inflation stalls economic growth.
We found ourselves in a very tough situation at the time. We began experiencing what, at least for the U.S., was runaway inflation.
Inflation was in the teens. The economy was going nowhere. With inflation like that, you couldn't get anywhere.
I remember buying an automobile, and I was so lucky. I paid an interest rate of 11.5%. Oh, terrible.
The term that was used at the time was stagflation, stagnation plus inflation.
On top of that, Carter has an international crisis on his hands.
We continue to hold the government of Iran responsible for the safety and for the early release of the American hostages who have been held so long.
For over a year, Carter has been trying to negotiate the release of 52 American hostages held in Tehran. So far, all of Carter's efforts to get the hostages home have failed.
The Carter administration attempted to free those Iranian hostages, and the whole expedition was a disaster.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. To my deep regret, 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed.
Carter and Reagan face off in a debate in October of 1980.
The two were much different in their approaches. Jimmy Carter, a little uptight.
It would be better to put into perspective what we're talking about.
Reagan was easy. Reagan was comfortable.
Says, I was a Democrat. I said many foolish things back in those days.
He was funny. He could deflect a question he didn't like. He could answer a question if it was tough.
But it was the end. Reagan looked in the camera and said, ask yourself,
are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
That was a real turning point in that campaign, and it paved the way for Reagan to become president.
Reagan wins the 1980 presidential election in a landslide victory. He is about to become the 40th president of the United States. He has brought his mother's Bible to place his hand on as he takes the oath of office.
Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
May I congratulate you, sir.
At age 69, Reagan is the oldest person elected to the office. Minutes later, the American hostages held in Iran are released.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free.
Reagan's supporters said, oh boy, those Iranians, they know not to mess with Ronald Reagan. They're scared of what we will do to them if they hang on to the hostages. That wasn't the reasoning at all. They wanted to get rid of the hostages, and they wanted to release them, but they weren't going to do Jimmy Carter any favors.
Soon after taking office, Reagan shares a philosophy which at the time was radical.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
It signals a sea change in American politics.
From the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, the predominant thinking in American politics was that government can be a solution. Reagan came along saying that no, in fact, things had changed. Government had gotten too big.
Through the force of this man's likability, personality, and general persuasiveness, he changed American life, American politics to an enormous degree.
It was a shift from the liberal age of Franklin Roosevelt to the conservative age of Ronald Reagan.
Reagan's economic plan of cutting taxes and promoting unrestricted free market activity, later called Reaganomics, is the most comprehensive overhaul since the New Deal. But before he could make sweeping changes, he had to appoint leadership.
His view, and I think it's the right view, is bring in people who know more about the subject that they're going to run than you do. One of the things that happened to Jimmy Carter, and one of the reasons he stumbled early on, was that he wanted to read everything, and he would go home at night with as much as 400 pages to read. And Reagan knew that's not the place of a leader. Your place is not down in the engine rooms of a ship. Your place is on the top deck, navigating. That's what Reagan did. Bring in really good, strong people, and there's no better example of that than George Shultz.
As Secretary of State, George Shultz becomes a valuable asset to Reagan.
The most influential member of his cabinet. Shultz brought an expertise and an experience that Reagan didn't have.
Ronald Reagan was a man who was comfortable with himself. He had clear views, and he believed in them.
Reagan knew the direction he wanted policy to go. Shultz was the one who made it get there.
But Reagan's closest advisor is Nancy.
She stayed in the shadows, and she did wield maybe more power than most of the first ladies who come out front.
She was his protector. If he wanted to be president, he could be president, but she was going to make sure that he was protected.
They were almost the entire emotional universe to each other. He always felt that the White House was a lonely place when Nancy was gone.
They wanted to be with themselves. Their idea of a big evening was having dinner by themselves, watching television, or old movies.
Well, show business was part of their thing. You know, their friends were all in and around the movie acting business.
You know, Reagan conducted his life in the White House much as a movie. Scene 1, my first meeting, done. Scene 2, and he took direction. He really took direction from his staff. So he acted his way through a lot of the scenes of his presidency.
But just 2 months into his term, a scene will play out that would shock the world. March 30th, 1981, Reagan gives a speech to the Federation of Labor Organizations at the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C.
That doesn't make much sense, Henry. He puts you here and then he runs around.
As the president leaves the building, shots ring out.
I was aware that suddenly there was a great commotion on my right. It was the Secret Service piling on John Hinckley Jr., but I was watching the president. I didn't think he'd been shot, but I didn't know.
He was pushed abruptly into the floor of the back seat of the limousine by his Secret Service guy.
Get the hell out of here! Get out!
Are you okay, Mr. President? Formaldehyde is okay. We're going to Crown.
Reagan feels a sharp pain in his rib. He thinks that the weight and the pushing has broken a rib. But then he starts to cough up blood. And he realizes, and the people in the car realize, that, in fact, he has been hit.
Oh, my God.
Reagan has no idea how badly he's been hit. A certain shock has set in, so he's not really feeling the pain. And he believes, as President of the United States, he's going to walk into the hospital, he will be checked, and that'll be fine. He gets in the outer doors of the hospital.
Sir, are you okay?
Mr. President! Come on.
And he promptly collapses. It's at that point that people realize that he is very close to dying.
After giving a speech to union leaders, the president is shot.
We didn't know at the White House in the beginning just how seriously he was injured.
It was obviously just a horrendous day for anybody who worked in the White House, because they were trying to contain something that could destabilize the whole country.
I was deeply, deeply worried that the nation was going to suffer another tragedy and we would lose a really good leader.
Let's check his vitals. Lock down this hospital now.
He's got the doctors around. They're all paying attention to him. And so he tries to make a joke.
I hope you're all Republicans.
He says, I hope you're all Republicans. Here's the president delivering these one-liners, even when he's at death's door. Then the chief surgeon says, Mr. President, today we're all Republicans.
The way he handled himself, he was John Wayne.
That was astonishing for someone who was so close to death to calm everybody else by saying, hey, I'm okay. I'm going to be okay.
There is a slug that apparently has ricocheted off the limousine that is embedded in his chest, very close to his heart.
This has just been handed to us. It's, I am told from the president's political counselor, Lynn Nofziger, that the president was hit in the left side of the chest, but he is all right.
I knew they weren't telling us the truth. I just knew it. I smelled it, I tasted it, I knew that they were covering something up.
There was a group of us who gathered in the Situation Room. So there was much we could do except to monitor and try to be reassuring and try to keep lines of communication open and make sure the country didn't get too rattled and that other countries who are rivals or enemies didn't take advantage of the situation. There was real worry about that.
Because of the delicacy of the situation, we wanted to inform you that the Vice President is on his way back to Washington. I would emphasize once again that the President's condition is stable.
My generation had grown up with a lot of assassinations. Jack Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Bobby. The attempt to take President Reagan's life was very much a part of that and very much, in our consciousness at the time.
This is the scene at George Washington Hospital in Washington, I believe, as the presidential limousine arrived there.
That's Mrs. Reagan.
And Mrs. Reagan, obviously concerned, being rushed into the hospital.
Nancy meets her husband as he's about to go into the operating room. And it's a very poignant scene, where she says, I love you. And he says, honey, I forgot to duck.
Honey, I forgot to duck, and hope you're all Republicans today to his doctors.
Hemingway once defined courage as grace under pressure, and that's exactly what Reagan showed in those hours after he was shot. There were no speechwriters around. There were no handlers. He was in there by himself. And here he is making jokes about his condition.
Meanwhile, the question on everyone's mind is why has a 26-year-old from Oklahoma tried to kill the president?
Hinckley is just somebody who's psychologically deranged, trying to impress a Hollywood star.
Obsessed with the actress Jodie Foster, the would-be assassin styles himself after the main character in Taxi Driver.
John Hinckley was inspired to shoot Reagan by watching a movie over and over, almost 100 times, I think.
Secret Service agent Jerry Parr has also been inspired by a film, an action film starring Ronald Reagan as a Secret Service agent.
Reagan was saved by the Secret Service agent who stepped in front of the bullet, who pushed Ronald Reagan into the car. When that man was a little boy, he had seen Ronald Reagan on the big screen, and he said to all his friends, that's what I'm going to be when I grow up, a Secret Service agent.
Reagan leaves the hospital less than 2 weeks later and returns to office with a 73% approval rating.
The question became, well, how should he return to public view? And what we recommended to him was to return by going to a joint session of Congress to make a plea for his economic program.
And Reagan was a sufficiently astute politician to milk that for everything it was worth.
Thank you all very much.
When he gives his first address to Congress afterwards, everybody is there. It's the hottest ticket in Washington. And he comes in, he gets a standing ovation from Republicans, Democrats. And Reagan lets the applause wash over him. He talks about a kid who sent him a letter.
And he said, I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas.
And that gets a laugh. And he segues seamlessly from that into a pitch for his tax cuts and his budget cuts.
I have come to speak to you tonight about our economic recovery program.
There's no question that it was a shrewd use of power that a president like Franklin Roosevelt would have very much admired.
Ronald Reagan said frequently, I don't see how you can be president of the United States if you haven't been an actor. And what he meant, of course, was have the ability to marshal public opinion in your favor by your presentation.
And the time for action is now. Thank you.
Successful politicians are ones whose presentation makes an impact on the public.
To deal with the dismal economy, Reagan retains one of Jimmy Carter's most significant appointments.
Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker, who was a very capable guy, but who was basically determined to put us into a recession. In order to break the back of this inflation thing.
People kept running into him, Mr. President, Mr. President is going to cause a recession. We're going to lose seats in the midterm elections.
It took enormous effort. He took a huge amount of heat for doing this. But it was the right thing to do.
And we did have a recession. We did lose seats. But by early 1983, inflation was clearly under control, and the economy took off like a bird. I always thought, in some ways, it was Reagan's finest hour domestically, because he knowingly took a short-term hit to get a long-term gain for the country.
There has never been a more sustained fear of nuclear war than there was during Reagan's first term. There was talk of a nuclear winter. The bombs would go off, dust would be blown up, and the earth would freeze beneath olive clouds. The only defense against nuclear weapons was something called mutual assured destruction, where we're not going to nuke them because they would nuke us. And Reagan thought this is unacceptable. We must be able to develop defenses. We need something that can shoot down those incoming missiles. Thus was born SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Deemed Star Wars by critics, SDI is a project for which the technology does not yet exist.
Almost no one else thought it was real, and it, to this minute, has not ever come to fruition.
But to Reagan, that was the only moral resolution to the nuclear dilemma.
However, the so-called Star Wars initiative was persuasive for other reasons.
If the United States threatened to build this system, the Soviets might feel obliged to match it. And therefore, there would begin a new arms race, in effect, a spending race. It might force the Soviets to the bargaining table.
Reagan was using this as a bargaining chip with the Soviets because apparently they thought it was possible.
We never gave away an inch of the research effort, but it was very much on the Soviets' mind. And they thought we were much further along than we were. So they were ready to make concessions.
Reagan kept saying in his first term that the Soviet leaders kept dying, which they did. 3 of them died in a row on him. And it wasn't until Mikhail Gorbachev, a young man with perhaps different ideas, that Reagan found someone that he could deal with.
But first, Reagan had to deal with the first major terrorist attack against U.S. forces.
I would like to ask you all, wherever you may be in this blessed land, to pray for these wounded young men.
He also had to deal with an impending election. It was time to find out if America would re-elect the 73-year-old former actor. Democrat Walter Mondale, former vice president under Jimmy Carter, runs against Reagan for the presidency. After proclaiming that it was morning in America again, Reagan faces his opponent in a series of debates.
Reagan was almost always really good at debates.
But this one would be very different.
Reagan was a trained actor. He knew how to memorize his lines. But Reagan stumbled in his opening.
The plan that we have had and that we're following is a plan that is based on growth in the economy, recovery without inflation, and reducing the share that the government is taking from the gross national product.
He got confused and circled around in his closing.
We have our military, the morale is high. I think the people should understand that 2/3 of the defense budget pays for pay and salary.
And it was gibberish. He made English sentences, but they didn't make any sense.
People who watched that debate wondered, is this Ronald Reagan? In fact, people who were favorably disposed toward Reagan wondered if he was too old. People around Reagan tried to explain it away. He was tired, he'd been busy. Nancy Reagan said that the people who were preparing him had tried to cram too much information into him. It's quite possible that this was a sign of his advancing age. Ron Reagan, his son, later said that he thought this was the first sign that his father was becoming forgetful. Is he actually too old?
But in the follow-up debate, Reagan relies less on cramming and more on humor. The result is that the 73-year-old man becomes the comeback kid.
Everyone's waiting. The guy named Henry Truitt from the Baltimore Sun asked the key question.
You already are the oldest president in history. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
And everybody laughs, even Mondale laughs. But if you listen closely to the laughter, it's the laughter not so much of, oh, that was a really funny line. It's laughter of relief.
He knows it's game, set, match. And sure enough, he's reelected handily.
Reagan wins the election, carrying the most electoral votes in U.S. history. But his second term would not be the blockbuster he'd hoped for. And how he responds to a series of tragedies will shape Ronald Reagan's legacy forever. When he begins his second term as president, Ronald Reagan establishes broad, sweeping goals.
Reagan was going to focus on a few big issues. He was going to try to shrink government at home. He was going to try to defeat communism abroad. The rest was details.
Act 1 is to meet with the Russian leader, Mikhail Gorbachev.
In Geneva, they met for the first time, and it was classic Ronald Reagan, the old Hollywood actor. It was a very cold day in Geneva. And down the steps from where they were meeting walked the President of the United States without a coat. They met, they shook hands, and then President Reagan cupped Gorbachev's elbow and helped him up the stairs. Well, a classic. Here's this old guy helping this young guy. Which leader then was seen as the man in charge? Ronald Reagan.
Over time, when they got to meet each other, when they got to talk, they came to a mutual respect.
By the way, the first time they met, the first subject that they ever discussed was Ronald Reagan's movies. That was what broke the ice, talking about Hollywood.
The two came to this belief that they should negotiate down the nuclear threat. This would have two good purposes. It would reduce the threat of nuclear Armageddon. There was less chance that the world would blow up in a nuclear mushroom cloud. And two, it would relieve financial strains on both sides.
He always said that his time at the Screen Actors Guild was extraordinarily important for learning the arts of negotiation before going to the White House. He frankly didn't think it was that difficult to negotiate with Gorbachev after he'd already negotiated with the Screen Actors Guild.
The critical moment comes when the two go to Reykjavik, Iceland. They start talking for the first time between these two leaders of a world beyond nuclear weapons. The total elimination of nuclear weapons. This was Reagan's dream. But they come to a sticking point.
That sticking point is the Missile Defense System, SDI, or Star Wars. Gorbachev wants the U.S. to cease development of the technology. Reagan sees SDI as vital to the defense of the U.S. and doesn't budge.
Everybody else around Reagan thought, we're going to get a great deal. We're going to use this as a bargaining chip. This is fabulous. It wasn't a bargaining chip to him. It was real to him. And this became a huge issue.
They finally realized we can't cut the deal. And they both walk out of the meeting almost brokenhearted.
Many fault Reagan for walking away from the most sweeping offer of nuclear arms reductions ever.
And things began to crumble.
In Central America, there is a growing concern about the communist regime in Nicaragua.
Central America is simply too close for us to ignore the danger of governments seizing power there with ideological and military ties to the Soviet Union.
A left-wing regime took over the government of Nicaragua. We proceeded to try to overthrow that government and did so by arming the Contras to try to overthrow the Sandinista government.
The support is eventually cut off by Congress that doesn't want this happening, feeling that the United States is going to be drawn into another Vietnam. Members of Reagan's administration have to figure out how to keep the money flowing. Meanwhile, Reagan has his own hostage issue.
Several American hostages have been taken in Lebanon by Hezbollah, which is closely tied to Iran.
Reagan took the hostage issue almost personally. He got to know the family members of the hostages. He knew their names. He knew their stories.
Iran is fighting a war with Iraq and needs weapons. In exchange for delivering weapons to Iran, the hostages are to be released.
Reagan is a big picture guy. Reagan doesn't pay close attention to the details of various things. He basically tells his people, this is what I want done, now you get it done. One of the people in charge of the Arms for Hostages deal is a guy named Oliver North, who figures we can overcharge the Iranians for the weapons and take the money and send it to the Contras.
He certainly was attempting to carry out what seemed to be a plan endorsed by the President and the Vice President of the United States.
And it's a backdoor deal, and it's all done in great secrecy. It has to be done in secrecy because it violates American law and stated American policy. And it is top secret until the lid gets blown off by a newspaper in the Middle East that hears about it.
Leaked by a senior official in Iran, the story reverberates around the world, and a dismayed Reagan finds himself starring in a real-life espionage thriller.
Here we were deliberately violating a law that Congress had passed saying the United States will not continue to assist this so-called rebel group.
The Iran-Contra scandal almost derailed Ronald Reagan's presidency. It was wrong, and it broke laws. And what I think made it worse was I don't think the president was really aware of all the parts of this enterprise.
Officially, the blame lies with Oliver North, John Poindexter, Caspar Weinberger, and others. But Reagan is criticized heavily for failing to properly supervise his subordinates. With his audience turning on him, Reagan goes to the airways to explain.
It's the Washington rule. When you get in trouble, come clean. Right away. Let it all hang out.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true. But the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Reagan knew more about the details of the Iran-Contra affair than he let on. He knew that weapons were going to Tehran and that they were bait to get the hostages released. Reagan was briefed on these various things that are happening. He even writes them down in his diary. But he later claims he didn't know about it. Now, either he was a really good actor, or, and this is entirely possible, he was becoming forgetful. Reagan was clearly slowing down, if nothing else, during his second term. By this time, he's in his mid-70s. He's spending less time in the office. He's coming to work later. He's going upstairs earlier.
The signs were strange because you would look at him and say, something's off. And then the next time you saw him, he was fine. And you would say, oh, well, I don't know what that was. And then it would happen again. And then 3 days later, he'd be sharp as a tack.
But questions about Reagan's mental health are put aside due to one fatal event.
6, we have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it is clear.
Reagan's best remembered speech, the one that many people consider to be the finest speech he ever gave, was one that he did not expect to give.
In the hours that followed, we saw endless repetitions of a rocket going in toward the sky and then exploding. It was extremely depressing to watch it because it was sort of gave us a sense of nothingness. There was no meaning, and you couldn't find anything to console yourself.
Immediately, Reagan realized, I've got to say something about this. Because the president is commander-in-chief, the president is head of state, but at a moment like this, the president has to be consoler-in-chief.
He will clearly begin with an expression of sorrow and sadness about what has happened today.
The president was to give his State of the Union speech that night. Well, within an hour, he'd postponed it. And he went on television, and he talked about the astronauts, and he talked about their sacrifice.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans.
And Reagan went on television that night, live television, and found meaning in what had happened. We're not going to remember the plume of smoke. What we're going to remember is them waving goodbye
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Reagan was able to use television in a way that Franklin Roosevelt had used radio. He spoke to the heart of the American people, and it was a reminder of what presidents do. It had nothing to do with policy. It had nothing to do with politics. It was about making a connection between the President of the United States and the people of the United States.
Reagan's handling of the Challenger disaster is seen as a defining moment in his second term. It will be one of many to come. On December 8, 1987, 1 year after the failed talks at Reykjavik, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to Washington to sign a treaty for nuclear arms reduction.
The elimination of intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe was hugely important and really marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And for that, Ronald Reagan deserves a lot of credit.
So big reductions took place as a result of Reagan's initiatives. I believe it's the case right now that the number of nuclear weapons in the world is like a third of what they were at the time of Reykjavik.
Meine Damen und Herren, und nun Ihre Exzellenzen, der Präsident der Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika, Mr. Ronald Reagan und Mrs. Nancy Reagan.
On June 12, 1987, Reagan is invited to address the people of West Germany at the Brandenburg Gate, just a stone's throw away from the notorious Berlin Wall. He decides to take the opportunity to challenge General Secretary Gorbachev.
As he always did, taken his speechwriter's speech and written in the margin, and he had inserted,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It was a phenomenal line that he was able to zero in on and deliver in such a way that there would be this huge payoff for it, just like the lines he had delivered on a soundstage at Burbank when he was in his early 30s.
Just over 2 years later, in November 1989, after mounting protests from East and West Germans, the wall comes down. In 1990, Nicaragua holds free elections, voting the communist government out of power. And in December 1991, Gorbachev dissolves the Soviet Union.
He knew from the beginning communism would be on the ash heap of history. He believed it firmly, and I think he's right.
I remember the last speech he gave from the White House, his farewell address. I was standing back among the cameras and the lights and the boxes. Everyone was going about their business, checking the sound, making sure everything was right. No one was looking at him, but he was sitting at his desk, going over his cards, speaking the words softly to himself. I could see his lips moving.
My fellow Americans, this is the 34th time I'll speak to you from the Oval Office, and the last.
He was training his mouth to go through the words so that it would be perfect when he gave it. People think he was so easy, he was the great communicator, it just came naturally to him as actor. He worked at it to the very last day.
And so, goodbye, God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Ronald Reagan, the citizen politician, leaves the White House with the highest approval rating since FDR. Reagan lives the final years of his life on his ranch in Santa Barbara, California.
I had the privilege of spending a weekend with him and him retelling tales of his earlier life. And what was striking to me about it was he told very few tales about being president of the United States. He had many funny stories about Hollywood.
But Reagan's mind begins to slip. This time, there is no denying it. He writes a sign-off letter to the American people, which reads in part, "My fellow Americans, I've recently been told that I'm one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease."
In 1994, he announces to the world in his farewell letter that he has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
He did a remarkable job on coping with Alzheimer's by writing that amazing note to the American people.
Unfortunately, as Alzheimer's disease progresses, the family often bears a heavy burden. I only wish there was a way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience. When the Lord calls me home, wherever that may be, I will leave with the greatest love for this country of ours and eternal optimism for its future.
I think Ronald Reagan demonstrated that optimism is a winning philosophy. And we're not seeing enough of that these days.
I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead.
And the thing he accomplished was giving us all a spirit that we're good people and that we're a good nation and that shining city on the hill is us and our better days lie ahead.
Thank you, my friends. May God always bless you. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan.